In the winter of 1925, in a quiet industrial town called Ravensbrück, a trembling man staggered into a police station just before dawn. His coat was torn, his face pale, and blood had dried along the side of his head. Between uneven breaths, he told officers a story that sounded almost too strange to believe. He claimed he had just escaped a man who tried to kill him with a heavy iron tool. At first, the officers weren't sure what to make of it. The man, a drifter named Elias Novak, explained that he had been invited into a small apartment on Gray Market Street by an older man who promised to pay him for help writing a letter. But once inside, something changed. The atmosphere shifted. The stranger's tone grew cold. And then, without warning, he struck. Novak had managed to survive only because the blow glanced off his skull instead of crushing it. Dazed and bleeding, he stumbled out into the hallway, screaming for help. A nearby carriage driver heard the noise and rushed in, finding Novak collapsing on the floor, barely conscious. His last words before passing out were simple. "The butcher, he tried to kill me." Within the hour, police arrived at number 14 Gray Market Street. The man they arrested did not look like a killer. He was 65 years old, soft-spoken, and widely known in the neighborhood as Uncle Victor. His real name was Victor Hallberg, a local butcher who had lived in Ravensbrück for decades. He was the kind of man people greeted warmly in the street, the kind of man who donated leftover meat to struggling families and occasionally played the organ at a nearby chapel. When officers questioned him, Hallberg remained calm. He admitted to striking Novak, but insisted it was self-defense. He claimed the younger man had tried to rob him, and he acted out of fear. To many, it seemed believable. After all, Victor Hallberg didn't fit the image of a violent attacker. Still, he was taken into custody. And then, 2 days later, something happened that changed everything. Victor Hallberg was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself using a makeshift cord fashioned from his bedding. There was no note, no explanation, just silence. At first, it looked like a tragic end to a misunderstanding, but something about it didn't sit right with investigators. Why would a man known for his calm demeanor and good standing in the community take his own life over what appeared to be a minor charge? The answer came when detectives decided to search his apartment. What they found inside would haunt the town of Ravensbrück for decades. Behind the neatly arranged furniture and modest living space, there was something hidden, something carefully concealed. In a locked storage area, officers discovered containers filled with preserved meat. But it wasn't animal meat. Not all of it. There were bones, human bones, stacked and sorted with unsettling precision. Jars containing pickled flesh, blood-stained clothing folded and stored as if they meant something. And then there was the ledger, a small, worn notebook. Inside, page after page of names, dates, details. Each entry described a person, where they came from, when they arrived, and when they were last seen. And next to many of the names, a final mark. Investigators quickly realized what they were looking at. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was a record, a system. As the list was analyzed, a pattern emerged. Most of the victims were travelers, laborers, drifters passing through Ravensbrück with no family nearby and no one to report them missing. People who could disappear without raising immediate suspicion. Except Novak had survived. And now, because of that, the truth was coming out. Authorities estimated there were at least 30 victims listed in the ledger, but given the number of remains found, many believed the real number could be even higher. What made the case even more disturbing was the realization that Hallberg had likely been selling some of the processed meat in his shop for years, possibly decades, to unsuspecting customers. As investigators dug deeper into Hallberg's past, a troubling picture began to form. He had been born in 1861 in a rural farming village not far from Ravensbrück. According to records, he was a quiet and withdrawn child. Neighbors later recalled that he rarely spoke, often keeping to himself for long periods. Eventually, he trained as a gardener and later found work as a butcher. After his father's death, he inherited a small sum of money, which he used to buy land. But his attempts at farming failed, and he moved into town, settling into the modest apartment on Gray Market Street. From there, he built a simple life, or at least that's what it looked like on the surface. The first suspected victim dated back more than 20 years, a young woman who had vanished without a trace. At the time, no connection had been made, and over the years, more people disappeared. A laborer here, a traveler there, each case isolated, each one forgotten, until now. One of the most shocking revelations involved a man who had been convicted years earlier for a murder that now appeared to be Hallberg's work. The case had been closed, the sentence served. An innocent man had paid for a crime committed by someone hiding in plain sight. Neighbors struggled to reconcile what they had learned. How could the man they knew, the polite butcher, the quiet church organist, be responsible for something so horrific? But the evidence was undeniable. The tools found in his apartment told their own story. A heavy iron pick, stained and worn, knives sharpened to precision, a saw used for cutting through bone. Everything had a purpose. Everything had been used. As the investigation expanded, more names from the ledger were identified. Workers, craftsmen, even elderly men who had simply passed through town and never been seen again. The youngest victim was barely a teenager, the oldest well into his 70s. There was no clear motive, no obvious trigger, only a pattern, only control. By the time the full scope of Victor Hallberg's crimes came to light, Ravensbrück had already changed forever. The butcher everyone trusted had been something else entirely. And the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. The discovery inside Victor Hallberg's apartment didn't just shock Ravensbrück. It unraveled years of quiet disappearances that no one had ever connected. For decades, people had come and gone through the town without much notice. Laborers looking for work, travelers passing through, men with no families nearby. When they vanished, it was easy to assume they had simply moved on. Now, investigators understood the truth. They hadn't left. They had been chosen. As forensic teams continued cataloging the remains found inside the apartment, the scale of the crimes became even more disturbing. Bones were sorted and grouped, almost methodically. Some had been cleaned, others still showed signs of cutting and preparation. This wasn't chaos, it was routine. The jars recovered from storage were sent to laboratories in nearby cities for testing. The results confirmed what detectives already feared. The preserved meat was human, and it had been processed in a way that suggested experience, care, familiarity. Hallberg hadn't been improvising. He had been doing this for years. The ledger became the key to everything. Each name represented a life that had slipped through the cracks of society. Some were identified through old employment records or distant relatives. Others remained nothing more than names and dates, with no one left to remember them. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't just the number of victims, it was the detail. Hallberg had written notes beside several entries, observations, habits, physical descriptions, in some cases, even comments about how easily the victim trusted him. It was clear he didn't see these people as individuals. To him, they were opportunities. As police followed the timeline in the ledger, they began linking Halberg to missing persons cases stretching back over 20 years. One of those cases reopened an old wound within the justice system. A man named Otto Weiss had been convicted years earlier for the murder of a young woman who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. He served over a decade in prison before being released for good behavior. Now, evidence strongly suggested that Halberg had been responsible for that crime. Weiss paid for something he never did. The revelation sparked outrage, but for many it was too late to make things right. The investigation also uncovered a detail that deeply unsettled the town. Halberg held a permit allowing him to sell small goods door to door, items like shoelaces and household supplies. Some of those products, investigators believed, had been made using materials taken from his victims. It meant his crimes didn't end inside his apartment. They extended into the community itself, quietly, unnoticed. Rumors began to spread quickly. People questioned where his meat had really come from. Customers who had once trusted him now wondered what they had unknowingly purchased. The weekly market, once a place of routine and familiarity, became a source of unease. No one could say for certain how far it went, but the doubt was enough. As winter turned to spring, Ravensbrück struggled to process what had happened. The investigation continued, but with Halberg dead, many answers would never come. Why did he start? What drove him? How did he live among people for so long without suspicion? There were theories. Some believed it was rooted in his isolated childhood. Others pointed to his long periods of withdrawal and detachment. A few suggested something darker, an obsession that had grown quietly over time until it consumed him. But in truth, no explanation felt sufficient. Months later, as cleanup efforts continued at the property, workers made another grim discovery. Buried in a small shed behind the building were additional remains, skulls and fragments that had been hidden beneath the floorboards. These findings pushed the estimated number of victims even higher, possibly over 40. Each one a person who would cross paths with the wrong man at the wrong time. The apartment was eventually sealed off, the butcher shop closed permanently, and Gray Market Street, once just another quiet part of town, became something else entirely, a place people passed quickly without looking too closely. Over time, the story faded from headlines. New events replaced old fears. New generations grew up hearing only fragments of what had happened, but the case never fully disappeared because it left behind something deeper than shock. It left a question that no one could answer. How does someone hide something like that for so long? Victor Halberg hadn't been a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was part of the community. He smiled at neighbors, spoke politely, lived a life that appeared ordinary in every way. And yet, behind closed doors, he had built a system of violence that lasted for decades. In the end, it wasn't an investigation that exposed him. It wasn't a pattern detectives uncovered. It was a mistake. One survivor, one moment where control slipped. If Elias Novak hadn't turned his head at the right second, if that blow hadn't landed just a little differently, the ledger might never have been found, the names might have remained unknown, and Victor Halberg might have continued unnoticed until the end of his life. That is what unsettled people the most, not just what he did, but how close he came to getting away with it completely. Even now, long after the case has faded into history, the memory of Ravensbrück's quiet butcher remains, not as the man people once knew, but as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one thinks to question.
In South Coast City, few people remembered his full name at first. To most, he was just another promising face that briefly lit up the screen and then slipped into obscurity. But to those who followed the early 90s wave of urban cinema, Marcus Langston was unforgettable for one reason: his role in the 1992 crime drama Streetlights. In the film's most iconic sequence, Marcus played a gang member leaning out of a stolen coupe, a cheap handgun in his hand, as he opened fire during a chaotic street chase. The scene became one of the defining images of early 90s street cinema. It was raw, unsettling, and strangely magnetic. Marcus, barely in his early 20s at the time, had no idea that a few seconds of screen time would shape the rest of his life. What most viewers didn't know was that Marcus never set out to be an actor. He wanted to make music. Hip-hop was his first language, rhythm his comfort zone. Acting came in almost by accident, the result of a chance introduction to a young filmmaker named Jordan Mills, who was trying to build a realistic portrayal of inner-city life using non-professional actors from real neighborhoods. Marcus fit the look perfectly. He had the confidence, the voice, and the unpredictable energy Mills wanted for his film. Within weeks, he was cast. Marcus was born in 1970 in Westbridge District, a working-class area on the edge of South Coast City. His father worked construction, and his mother handled bookkeeping for a small clinic. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. He had a younger brother, Caleb, and a quiet childhood that friends later described as ordinary but bright. He wasn't a troublemaker early on. In school, he was known more for humor than aggression. Teachers remembered him as sharp but unfocused, someone who could have excelled if he had stayed consistent. He played basketball, wrote lyrics in notebooks he kept hidden in his room, and spent weekends at small community music sessions. After high school, he drifted between jobs. A brief attempt at community college didn't last long. He worked with his father for a while in construction, but it wasn't what he wanted. His real obsession was still music, and now, unexpectedly, film. That's when Jordan Mills entered the picture. Mills was developing Streetlights, a gritty independent film about three young men navigating crime, friendship, and survival in South Coast City's toughest neighborhoods. He didn't want trained actors. He wanted authenticity. Marcus was introduced through a mutual friend at a recording studio. Mills noticed him immediately, not because he was polished, but because he wasn't. He spoke like someone who had lived the environment the film was trying to depict, even though he hadn't been deeply involved in it himself. The audition was simple: improvise a confrontation scene. Marcus didn't overthink it. He just performed it naturally, almost casually. That was enough. Within months, he was on set. The production of Streetlights was chaotic but focused. Most of the cast were local, many with no prior acting experience. Jordan Mills directed them like a documentary rather than a scripted film, encouraging improvisation and emotional honesty over technical precision. Marcus quickly became one of the standout performers. He wasn't disciplined, but he had instinct. Crew members described him as someone who could switch between charm and intensity without warning. One moment he was joking with the team, the next he was locked into a scene with unsettling seriousness. His breakout moment came in the film's central sequence, involving a botched robbery and a sudden escalation into violence. Marcus's character, Reese, becomes the emotional center of the chaos. The scene was filmed in a single long take. When it was over, even the crew went silent for a few seconds. Jordan Mills later said that Marcus didn't just act the part, he understood the rhythm of it too easily. When Streetlights released in 1992, it wasn't a blockbuster, but it gained strong critical attention. It was nominated for several independent film awards and developed a cult following. Marcus became the face everyone remembered. But fame, even limited fame, changed things. At first, it was small: free entry into clubs, people recognizing him on the street, invitations to parties hosted by people connected to the entertainment industry. Marcus enjoyed it, but didn't fully know how to manage it. He hired an agent, went to auditions, tried to build momentum, but the industry didn't move as fast as he expected. Roles became inconsistent. Opportunities that seemed guaranteed never materialized. The excitement that followed streetlights slowly began to fade. Around this time, something else started shifting. Marcus began spending more time in neighborhoods he grew up near but had rarely been deeply involved with, not out of necessity, but curiosity. Friends noticed the change. He started dressing differently, speaking differently. There was a growing edge in his personality that hadn't been there before. He was still not a criminal, not yet, but he was drifting. A minor incident in 1990 marked his first real brush with law enforcement. A late-night confrontation outside a college gathering escalated into chaos. Marcus wasn't the instigator, but he was present. By the time police arrived, he was detained briefly due to identification issues. He spent a short time in custody before being released without charges. What alarmed his friends wasn't the arrest itself, it was his reaction afterwards. He treated it lightly, even laughed about it. That attitude worried people closest to him. His family tried to steady him. His father encouraged him to step away from unstable influences and focus on construction work or formal training. His mother pushed him towards stability, but Marcus had already started pulling away from structure in general. His relationship with his father grew strained when he began spending less time working and more time pursuing music and nightlife. At one point, in frustration, his father even damaged some of his recording equipment during an argument about priorities. It didn't resolve anything. It only deepened the divide. By 1993, Marcus was still getting occasional film work, including a small role in a follow-up urban drama directed by Jordan Mills, but the momentum was gone. The industry was no longer chasing him the way it briefly had. Around the same time, his behavior outside of work became harder to ignore. He missed auditions, showed up late to meetings, sometimes didn't show at all. People who had once seen him as a rising talent started describing him differently, less as an actor, more as someone unpredictable. Then came the turning point. Marcus moved out of his family home and relocated to a district known informally as the Lower Grid, an area associated with rising gang activity and territorial disputes. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but it marked a clear shift in environment. Friends from earlier years were confused. Some thought it was research for roles. Others assumed he was trying to build credibility for future projects. But over time, it became clear he was no longer observing that world, he was spending time inside it. He began associating with individuals tied to local street groups. At first, it was social, then increasingly personal. He stopped attending industry events, stopped responding to calls from his agent. The distance between his acting career and his new environment widened quickly. By the mid-90s, Marcus Langston was no longer just a former actor trying to restart his career. He was becoming something entirely else. Someone's name was beginning to circulate in places far removed from film studios. And that shift was only the beginning of what would come next. By the mid-1990s, Marcus Langston's life no longer resembled the trajectory people once predicted for him. The industry that had briefly embraced him after streetlights had moved on. New faces replaced old ones quickly, and Marcus, once seen as a breakout talent, became another forgotten name in a crowded system. But he wasn't trying to return anymore. In South Coast City's Lower Grid, Marcus had fully embedded himself in a different rhythm of life. People who knew him during that period described a man who still carried himself like an artist, but one who had slowly adopted the logic of the streets around him. Respect mattered more than opportunity. Reputation mattered more than stability. The transition didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost casual at first. A shift in clothing style, new friends, new routines. Then came the distancing from old contacts entirely. Calls from his former agent went unanswered. Invitations to auditions were ignored. Even Jordan Mills, the director who had first given him a chance, eventually stopped reaching out. Mills later admitted he didn't recognize the version of Marcus that emerged after 1994. By 1995, Marcus was no longer attending industry spaces at all. Instead, he was frequently seen in parts of the city known for high tension between rival street groups. His presence there was noted not because he was officially part of any organization at first, but because of how quickly he adapted. He wasn't reckless in the traditional sense. People described him as calculated, quiet, observant. But when conflict arose, he no longer stepped away from it. That change concerned those who remembered who he used to be. Small incidents began to accumulate in police records: a confrontation outside a late-night venue, a weapons charge that was later dropped due to lack of evidence. Rumors circulated faster than facts, as they often do in environments like that. Marcus's name started appearing in police briefings not as a suspect in major crimes, but as someone connected to escalating local disputes. At the same time, his personal life was unraveling in quieter ways. He moved between temporary residences, sometimes stayed with acquaintances, sometimes disappeared for days. His relationship with his family became distant, reduced to occasional contact with his younger brother Caleb, who repeatedly urged him to leave the city and reset his life. Marcus rarely responded directly to those appeals. By 1997, the shift became more visible. Reports linked him to a series of violent incidents tied to disputes over territory and narcotics distribution in the lower grid area. Nothing was immediately proven, but his proximity to these events tightened suspicion around him. What made it more complicated was his public memory. People still associated him with streetlights. That contrast between his screen image and his real-life associations created a strange narrative around him. Some saw it as a tragedy, others as inevitability. Most simply watched from a distance. Friends from his early acting days described attempts to reach him that went nowhere. He was polite when contacted, but distant, as if he had placed his former life in another category entirely. Then came the incident that changed everything. In the summer of 1999, police responded to a shooting in a semi-industrial area near East Harbor District. 2 individuals were killed during what investigators later described as a dispute tied to drug territory negotiations. Witness statements placed Marcus at the scene before and after the incident. He did not flee the city. Instead, he continued moving between locations under his own name, as if unaware of the scale of attention building around him. Within weeks, he was officially named in a warrant related to the double homicide investigation. What followed was a period of instability. Marcus moved frequently, staying with different acquaintances, avoiding predictable patterns. Despite being wanted for questioning, he was still seen occasionally in public spaces, including one brief sighting at a film production office where he had previously worked years earlier. That visit became part of the myth around him later. Some interpreted it as denial, others as detachment. Those closest to him said it felt more like exhaustion. The arrest came in late 1999. Police tracked him to a residential area after receiving a tip. When officers approached, Marcus attempted to leave the location on foot, then briefly on a bicycle. The pursuit ended quickly. He was taken into custody without further resistance. At the time of his arrest, he reportedly made no formal statement beyond confirming his identity. The trial that followed drew attention largely because of who he once was. Prosecutors built their case around witness testimony and circumstantial evidence placing him in connection with the killings. The defense argued inconsistencies in identification and gaps in physical evidence, but the broader narrative had already formed in the public eye. After a lengthy trial, Marcus Langston was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was transferred to a high-security facility along the coast in early 2001. Inside prison, Marcus changed. but not in the way many expected. He avoided conflict with other inmates and instead turned toward religion. Over time, he became involved in study groups and began corresponding with a prison chaplain. He spent long hours reading and writing notes in a worn notebook he kept with him constantly. To some inmates, he became known as quiet and reflective. To others, he remained a figure whose past followed him into confinement. He wrote letters describing attempts to understand his life choices, often framing his situation as something shaped by circumstance and consequence rather than a single turning point. Years passed without major incident. Then, in 2005, he was assigned to share a cell with another inmate, a man serving a life sentence for unrelated violent crimes who had developed deeply unstable beliefs while incarcerated. The two initially maintained distance, but tension grew over time, largely centered around ideological and religious conflict. Marcus had become more openly religious during this period, often speaking about faith and redemption. His cellmate rejected those views entirely. What began as a verbal disagreement escalated into repeated confrontations inside the confined space of the cell. Eventually, it turned physical. Marcus Langston was killed during one of those altercations. His death was not immediately discovered. Hours passed before prison staff realized something was wrong during routine checks. By the time officials entered the cell, it was too late. The official report cited internal injuries consistent with a violent struggle. The circumstances, however, remained contested, particularly regarding supervision and cell assignment procedures. His family questioned the account provided by the prison. His brother, Caleb, by then living a quiet life outside the city, described the entire trajectory of Marcus's life as something that never fully made sense in hindsight, as if multiple versions of the same person had existed at different times. In the years that followed, Marcus Langston's story became part of South Coast City's cultural memory. To some, he remained the young actor from Streetlights, frozen in a moment of early promise. To others, he became an example of how quickly fame, environment, and personal choices can intersect in destructive ways. There were no clean explanations, no single cause that fully accounted for everything that happened. Only fragments, a film roll, a shift in identity, a descent that never stabilized enough to reverse, and in the end, a life that moved too far from where it started to ever find its way back.